Welcome to Frontline Conversations. Cash transfers to women are a contentious issue among academics and feminists. While some see it as a recognition of the value of women's unpaid labor, others view it as a reinforcement of housework as a gendered expectation placed on them. Today, we are here to discuss a book that explores this tension. The book is titled Wages for Housework: India's Experiment with Unconditional Cash Transfers to Women. It's an open access title published by Oxford University Press. It was authored by Professor Prabha Kotiswaran, Professor of Law and Social Justice at King's College London. Wages for Housework examines India's experiment with unconditional cash transfer to women. It looks at the schemes through the lens of feminist social reproduction theory and explores the implementation in three states: Goa, Assam, and West Bengal. Welcome, Professor Prabha. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with the title, Wages for Housework. Are you making a case for paying women for housework, or ultimately a case against unpaid housework? What was your intended reading of this?
So thank you so much for this invitation. So the book is titled Wages for Housework, and it draws inspiration from the feminist campaign of the 1970s, also titled Wages for Housework, which took shape in Italy, in UK, in Canada, and many countries in Western Europe. And the fundamental thesis of that campaign was that when a male worker goes onto the factory floor in order to perform work, actually what is invisible behind the labor that he produces for the employer is the unpaid work of his wife back at home, and that her unpaid labor in turn produces and generates surplus value for the capitalist as much as the labor of the male employee. So the whole goal of the Wages for Housework feminists, who are heavily misunderstood, including by other feminists, was to simply say that because women's unpaid work generates surplus value for the capitalists, you cannot recognize it unless you put a price on it. You have to put a price on it for it to be considered to be valuable. That's why Wages for Housework. But their understanding was always that you may not literally ask for a wage for housework, but you are actually against housework. And within the movement itself, there were different strands of thinking. One strand, led by Selma James, calls for a care income in recognition of women's unpaid work. Whereas the other perspective from Silvia Carevici talks about wages for housework as being a political perspective, which is to put a price on unpaid work so as to reject it, so as to create time for women to be able to paint, to be able to take a walk, to engage in leisure, and not simply become yet another necessarily a productive member of the economy. So there's a strong anti-productive strain also within wages for housework. So very much the book that I've written draws inspiration from the campaign and talks about how in the Indian context, where the gender division of labor is so heavily entrenched, the idea would be to economically recognize women's unpaid work with the view to reject it and to redistribute it with men.
Moving on to India's unconditional cash transfers. You call it a revolution with many false starts. What makes this a revolution, and what are these false starts? And you kind of resist reading it as purely about being about electoral gains. Could you please elaborate it for us?
So the mainstream narrative around cash transfers is that women are giving their votes in exchange for cash transfers or money or rates, right? But this is deeply problematic because even political scientists who study elections have shown that there is a correlation between cash transfers and electoral outcomes, but there is no causal relationship between the two. And the reality is that in a very short space of 5 years, we've gone from having literally 1.5 lakh women getting cash transfers in Goa in 2021 to now 120 million women across 13 states getting these cash transfers, with 3 more states that are about to implement the cash transfers. So we are talking about 17% of India's female population getting cash transfers. So the reality is that cash transfers are popular across the political spectrum. So in any given election, actually, you cannot trace back an electoral outcome to these promises. And, voting decisions are very complex. Now, the reason why I call it a revolution is that I believe that it is redistributive, putting money in the hands of women where they may not actually be engaged in paid employment and where they don't have control over household finances is, I believe, a deeply redistributive move. It may not be transformative, but it is redistributive. And for that reason, I don't believe you can be against it. Now, the reason why I argue that there have been many false starts is that, very interestingly, although I initially took inspiration from the wages for housework movement of the 1970s. In reality, there is a lot of indigenous thinking around the need for economic recognition of women's unpaid work. So, well before the 1970s, even in the late 1930s, nationalist feminists were pretty much uh, presenting their version of wages for housework feminism. And they, in fact, said, we shouldn't recognize women's unpaid work simply because they reproduce male labor, but because in and of itself, it amounts to an occupation. And that unless you have economic recognition of women's unpaid work, there will never be any value to the work that they do and to the other forms of paid employment that women may engage in. So, although the nationalist feminists at the point of the drafting of the Constitution called for economic recognition of women's unpaid work, it did not actually happen. And then there were several initiatives, even in 2012, from the Ministry of Women and Child Development, to see if women could have control over half the income that their husbands brought in. There was a push to introduce a statute on matrimonial property. None of these actually worked. In the meantime, we find that appellate courts in India, over a very 50, 60-year period, very slowly beginning to articulate a theory of economic recognition of women's unpaid work in the context of motor vehicles accidents. So I call this wages for household jurisprudence. So they departed from typical common law principles in the case of injuries to say, we will compensate dependents of these women because the work that women were doing in the home actually is valuable and it should be treated on par with an occupation. So, as you can see, there have been many false starts. But what the consistent thread that runs through the independence period, the post-independence period, and most recently in the articulations of certain politicians, for example, Mamata Banerjee, who literally articulates the wages for housework thinking to say that this is and the notification for the Tamil Nadu scheme. So we see that this has been a consistent theme in Indian thinking, and therefore, finally, we find there is in fact economic recognition of women's unpaid work uh, uh, after several years of and decades of thinking about it.
We'll get to the electoral politics side of it once again, but before that, I wanted to touch upon the pushback from a section of feminists against cash transfers. Could you briefly unpack it for us?
Absolutely. So in 2021, when Kamal Hassan first came up with the idea of salaries for housewives, there was a robust feminist debate on whether unconditional cash transfers were welcome or not. And as you can tell, this idea of thinking about women's unpaid work has a very long history in feminist thinking, even before the right to vote. And there's a very sophisticated literature amongst feminists from multiple disciplines on how do you deal with women's unpaid work? How do you recognize it? How do you reduce it? How do you redistribute it? How do you disrupt the gender division of labor? So this has been a very consistent theme in feminist thinking. So when these promises were made in 2021, feminist economists were the first to argue that this could be problematic because remember, we had low and declining female labor force participation in India until very recently. And feminist economists said, well, cash transfers will disincentivize education. It will disincentivize women's need to perform paid employment. And worst of all, it would reinforce the gender division of labor. And then there is the very fundamental insight that you may give women money, but men may control their bank accounts, and therefore they would not have control over this money. So those were some of the very strong objections to it. And I think it's understandable because a generation of women who've been out and been very successful in paid work were very fiercely resisting the pushback to the realm of the household, what they viewed as a pushback to the realm of the household. Of course, I believed at that point that I wasn't entirely sure that these assumptions were valid. So I've set out to assess the empirical realities of these assumptions, and that was the root for this book.
We'll get to the empirical part of your findings, but isn't it fair criticism that these schemes do serve electoral politics? Politics do influence how these schemes are announced, designed, and how these schemes often get terminated when the government terms end. So, can it be denied that these do serve electoral politics?
Yes, absolutely, they do, but that is a two-way channel, right? I think if we are feminists and we believe in women's agency, we should also look at what women have to say about it, right? So, of course, the political parties, the political consultants, the bureaucrats, they all have their own understandings of the cash transfers and welfare and poverty allegation and so on. But I think once an election is won, there are many stakeholders who come onto the scene, and the most critical for me are the women themselves. And when I went to the women and asked them, so often we would assess the impact of a scheme a year after they had been rolled out. Because that's when, some of the teething problems around the scheme are resolved and women begin to get the amounts regularly. And when you actually go to them and ask them, many women actually told us they were not voting simply because of the cash transfers. We, in fact, diffused that idea. And they came up with very sophisticated narratives of welfare, of their relationship with the state. Some of them said, well, it's our tax money. They're just giving it back to us. Some of them said, well, it's the duty of the state to provide us decent work. They're not able to do it. Therefore, they are giving us these cash transfers. Some of them said, what is the point of this when we have such high rates of inflation? Some of them said, well, we would like more money, but a state has limited coffers, and India is a country of poor people. They can't give all of us money. So you see very nuanced ideas. And some of them said, we're not just going to vote for our own needs. We're also going to think about whether a government would take into consideration the welfare of the entire community and the entire state. So you see very nuanced ideas of welfare and their thinking as citizens and their expectations of the state. And this is what I was trying to unpack. And I actually argue that in the book, that these cash transfers herald the renegotiation of the gendered social contract between women and the state, between women and their politicians. And we've seen this in our studies, that there is an uptick in the political influence that these women have. And more importantly, it also disrupts the marital bargain. So there is a time where there is a state, the family, and the women. And so it has ripple effects on all of these relationships.
I think you do use some of these as the foundation for the suggestion in your book that this is exactly why feminists should take more stake in the policy making of unconditional cash transfers, and this shouldn't be left to politicians alone. Is one of your conclusions. And why, in your view, is feminist intervention necessary in unconditional transfers, and how can it be?
Yeah. So the thing is that cash transfers are not a new phenomenon. They to women in particular. We've seen them in other parts of the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in very different contexts. And in Latin America, they were mostly conditional cash transfers, which did require women to satisfy certain health conditions, certain educational outcomes for their children, and in the absence of which they wouldn't get the cash transfer. So in that instance, it did reinforce the gender division of labor. And the problem there is, although some of these schemes were inaugurated with a view to women's empowerment, because women themselves were not involved, either in the form of women's wings of political parties or feminists or women's movement, or the beneficiaries themselves in the understanding and the implementation of this scheme, what actually happens is that it becomes a technocratic exercise on the part of the state. And then once the international organizations come into the play, then they're trying to look for impacts that are easy to measure. And typically, economists, become the voices of authority in this instance, whereas something like women's empowerment takes a very long time to actually gauge. So the whole idea, the call for feminists to be part of this debate in India is to make sure we don't repeat that mistake in the Indian context. In the Indian context, what is unique is that the cash transfers are unconditional and they've been rolled out at scale. So it's, I believe, unprecedented at the international level. And it's crucial that women and feminists are part of the debate. And the very simple point of my book is to simply say that no matter what kind of work women perform, whether it's unpaid work within the home, whether it's paid care work outside the home, or whether they're working in paid employment, say in factories or in the service sector, there is something about the taint of unpaid work performed within the household which undermines their bargaining power out in the market, which results in a gender pay gap, results in various forms of discrimination, and often results in them just being treated as, volunteers. So whether they're working for the market, for an individual household as domestic workers or for the state, their labor is undervalued. So unless you recognize unpaid work as valuable, you are going to have no impact on all of these other perversities in the labor market. And conversely, unconditional cash transfers, to the extent that they offer economic recognition of unpaid work, are critical to this larger project, but they need to be embedded in a structural project of transformation within a feminist agenda for pay.
Let's move on to your research and the findings and begin with the methodology itself. Given the scope of the fieldwork, how did you navigate the interstate and the intrastate differences, and what were the limitations you encountered, and how did it limit the scope of the book?
Yeah. So, I'm trained to be a lawyer and I do qualitative research. So the book deals with qualitative research in three states, although this is an area which in development economics is more prone to, econometric analysis. So after studying these three states, I did, as part of an interdisciplinary group, undertake mixed method studies in the states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, but I won't talk about that. In this book, I only engage with qualitative research. So obviously, the choice of the states depended entirely on when these cash transfers were rolled out there. And interestingly, the state of Goa had inaugurated this cash transfer scheme in 2013, but it had been barely studied. So that was the starting point. And then Assam and West Bengal very soon thereafter implemented the cash transfers. So of course, the challenge of doing anything, any work in India is so the sheer complexity, the differences between the various states, and the differences within each state, within the rural and the urban. But there's just so many, uh, there's very uneven levels of development even within a particular state. So in terms of sampling, in terms of making sure that you let women from various socioeconomic strata, caste strata, tribal statuses, and so on, was quite complicated. So obviously, given that it's qualitative research, we couldn't reach all the districts in these various states. The other limitation is that in the Indian context, the cash transfers had been rolled out at breakneck speed. So there's actually no baseline study and there's no phased introduction of these schemes. So what that means is you can't actually go back to the same. If you had a baseline, you could go back after 2 years and ask women, what has changed for you? We've not been able to do that, unfortunately. So that is one of the difficulties of doing this kind of research. And of course, there are the language barriers and so on. And of course, sometimes field workers luck. Sometimes you're able to meet bureaucrats, sometimes you're able to meet more NGOs and so on. But in every state, the primary emphasis was on meeting women themselves, beneficiaries of these schemes, to test out some of the assumptions that had informed the feminist debate around the cash transfers.
I think you do call the lack of research around the Goa scheme a missed opportunity, because it's been around for 10 years and there hasn't been much study into it and how it has affected the lives of women. Let's first talk about Goa. What were your sharpest observations from Goa about the scheme and its implementation?
Yeah, I think so. Goa is very interesting because, of course, it was the result of the then Chief Minister Manohar Parrikar's intuition that women are responsible for the welfare of the household, and in the context of high levels of inflation, which persists to date, he thought that something that supported the household in the form of the Griha Aadhar scheme would be very valuable in order to reduce malnutrition and to give some comfort to women who might be running short on cash. And interestingly, it was also done through a direct bank transfer at a time when Aadhar was just being rolled out. So it is very unique in that sense as a pioneering state. But unfortunately, I believe that there were many implementation problems with the scheme, which were persistent even prior to the pandemic and continued even after the pandemic. And this is something that I document in the book. And I think one of the problems with the Goa scheme is that there hasn't been much evaluation of the scheme. There's been no involvement of women themselves in understanding what the impact of the scheme is. And because it is a high income state and the cash transfer is not inflation indexed, we see that, the payment is about 1,500 rupees. But over time, it's become a routine payment to women with various implementation problems. But because there was no messaging around this scheme, there was no assessment of this scheme, and actually not even a celebration when the scheme turned a decade. We actually don't know what the impact of this scheme is on women's lives. Of course, the women I met were very happy getting the cash transfers. So, in that sense, I believe that it's a missed opportunity. If there had been more robust measures of messaging around this scheme and study of this scheme, we could learn more from it for the cash transfers in other states. And in a sense, it's a warning because if in other states we continue to roll out these cash transfers, which would be very hard to roll back. So I believe the cash transfers are here to stay. So if we don't at this point make it more transformative and more focused towards empowerment of women, then we could end up having a scheme which one bureaucrat referred to as a scheme being on a ventilator, where you're not getting the benefit of investing in the scheme in terms of improvement in human development and most importantly, women's empowerment.
How does the Assam's Arunodaya scheme fare on similar benchmarks, and what were women in Assam hoping for from the scheme, and where do you think the scheme fell short there?
So actually, it's very soon to say how Arunodaya, what the true impact of the scheme is, because it's been only a few years since it was implemented. And when we did the field work, women resoundingly were in favor of the cash transfers. Of course, we asked various questions of whether they wanted jobs or cash transfers, and there's very complex answers to that. But by and large, women prefer jobs over cash transfers. But you could see that it has a huge impact on a daily basis for very poor households. So, 2/3 of the families that we actually surveyed, were earning less than 5,000 rupees a month. So, in that context, when you're giving them, at that point, it was 830 rupees. Now it's 1,250. So, given that level of monthly household income, this is not a small amount for these households. So, what is interesting about Assam and looking at these states side by side is that they all had what one of my colleagues, Lewis Stidham, called subnational welfare regimes. So each state has its own idea of how to deal with issues of women's empowerment and what welfare would look like for women in that particular state. So I've tried to map out the trajectory of these subnational welfare regimes for women while offering a feminist assessment of these welfare regimes. So unlike in Goa, where the scheme was thought to be, a cushion against inflation, but also as an implicit recognition of women's unpaid work. In Assam, the reasoning behind the scheme is more diffuse. Sometimes it's been referred to as a poverty alleviation scheme, sometimes as, uh, uh, aimed at women's empowerment, sometimes at producing nutritional security and empowering human development, and so on. So initially, the scheme was aimed at women's empowerment, but one of the explicit rationales for the scheme was also to rationalize the social security schemes of the state. So the state has gone through various iterations, another 1, another 2.0, and another 3.0, and the most recent iterations, certain other welfare schemes relating to disabled people and to old age pension had been uh, folded back into Arunodaya. So there is a rationalization of the scheme, but it continues. So in a sense, there is some dilution of the initial goal of women's empowerment, but it's also an interesting scheme because whereas in Goa, you need to be a married woman to access the scheme, in Assam, actually, priority is given to single women and to households where there are disabled people. So it's very interesting. So although it's both states are run by the BJP, there are, the schemes are not tied to the ideology of the ruling party necessarily. So it's too soon to say for Assam, but the initial indication is that it is actually in a state that has very low per capita income, that it is actually quite valuable for the women there.
I think what sets apart Goa, Assam, and West Bengal is the fact that West Bengal had a more explicit political framing around the scheme. So, what were your ground experiences from West Bengal about the Lakshmi Bhandar?
Yeah. So, of course, my chapter was, finalized before the election outcomes of 2026. So, I had occasion to really study in great depth, what the subnational welfare regime of West Bengal was, and of course, having a chief minister like Mamta Banerjee. I mean, what is very interesting, I think, she's of course a complex figure, But her thinking around welfare is explicitly feminist. That's my argument in the book, because she had a life cycle approach to welfare, and she tried very hard to reflect the lived experiences of women. So, for example, women live much longer than men. Therefore, the pension scheme, the old age scheme, has to be mirroring that reality of women's life. So, in her autobiography, she actually talks about various aspects of this. And specifically in relation to the Lokhi Bhandar scheme, she says very specifically that this is what we would call literally wages for housework, that women perform various forms of unpaid domestic and care work. But interestingly, she also talks about what Indian feminists have said for a long time, which is that when you think of unpaid work in the global south, you have to think about subsistence agriculture. You have to think about unpaid economic activity that women do. When they work in in the family enterprise, they're beekeeping or they're in livestock cultivation, so on. They don't get any income from this. The family income doesn't go to them. So she talks about how the Lokhi Bandar is actually, a recognition of all this work that women perform. So it's explicitly feminist. And more generally, in West Bengal, there are other schemes like Kanyashri, for example, which is a conditional cash transfer scheme for girls in higher education. The scheme doesn't just stop with paying out money, but also there's a social element to it. There are Kanyashri clubs. The idea is it should result in social transformation. So in West Bengal, although many of the responses from the women were similar to that we saw in Assam and Goa, around the adequacy of it, around the need for jobs, around the need to disrupt the gender division of labor, what is interesting about West Bengal was how Lokhi Bandar had seeped into the cultural fabric of the state. So you saw, beautiful cultural representations of how, now men would come back from the fields in these videos. You see YouTube videos, and they're waiting for the women to actually bring them a glass of water, and the women are nowhere to be seen. And then the women waltz in, bringing their two 500 rupee notes, and the husbands are saying, well, what happened to what you were supposed to do within the household? And the woman is very confident, and you see how she's rejecting actually many of the gendered expectations of her within the household. So it's fascinating to see how this has actually launched a conversation around the gender division of labor in West Bengal.
Professor Prabha, what were the differences in the expectations and experiences of women from the rural and urban settings?
Thank you. That's such an important question in the Indian context, given our very vast rural population. So I consciously chose to study these schemes in the rural areas. So we have done some focus group discussions in urban areas, but we were primarily interested in what this means in rural India, because actually, uh, in the urban context, 500 rupees, the urban elite just scoff at it and they say, that's a joke. What does 500 rupees actually buy you? That is true to some extent. But in rural India, where income levels are very low, 500 rupees can actually go a long way. I mean, and we did hear about especially older destitute women, about how they couldn't afford to buy food earlier, like vegetables and fresh produce. But with this money, were actually able to improve nutritional outcomes. And this is a finding that has been confirmed in our work in other states, where we actually measured this at the household level and at the individual level. So I think in the rural areas, these cash transfers go farther. And in the urban areas, though, there is a more explicit feminist understanding of, so if you ask women, why do you think you're getting this money? So in the urban areas, women are more likely to say that this is for women's empowerment. Whereas in the rural areas, they understand gender equality. In fact, women, you would think in rural India, women need to be, their consciousness needs to be lifted to aim for gender equality, but they could see this through with tremendous clarity. They would tell us, nowadays you need two jobs. Both men and women have to work, and we have to be egalitarian in these marriages, and men have to do more at home. And so for women who didn't work outside the home would say, give us jobs and we will disrupt this gender division of labor. We will make sure that men reach out to their mothers to do more of the unpaid work, or we will make them do more. But then, of course, there were also women, because many of these schemes are means tested. So these are poorer families. And in those families, women often do paid work outside the home. And there, despite doing paid work outside the home, they realized that the gender division of labor was not changing. So there's a real need for us to take very seriously how to invest in the care economy, in care infrastructure, but more importantly, you know, disrupt these stereotypes around unpaid work, because we are seeing that even young children take these gendered roles for granted, and that caused women tremendous pain. So that was the most counterintuitive learnings from the research in rural parts of the country.
Looking beyond India, how does India's experiment fare compared to the ones in Africa, which are often shaped by World Bank and IMF, or the conditional transfer, cash transfers of Latin America? Is India's framing radically different comparatively?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe so. I think it's very interesting because, as you rightly said, the role of international institutions makes a huge difference in the terms on which these cash transfer schemes are rolled out, how they are understood, and questions of the impact of cash transfers is a deeply political question. You can't, and, although this is the realm of development economics where you want to measure everything, because these cash transfers are aimed at women and because they are aimed at women's empowerment, simply using econometric methods is simply not enough, which is why I think it's very important to conduct feminist research on these cash transfers to really not simply ask, how does this improve the household, food consumption, or what do you do with the money, what do you use it on, and so on and so forth. You have to really start with where women are at, what is their role within the household and within the economy, to then ask what the impact of cash is. And so, while experts on welfare argue that money depoliticizes, the political relationship with the state and so on, I think, in fact, cash is can be most disruptive here. So, actually, women would often say that there are other schemes, say for toilets and so on, where they had to rely on intermediaries at the village level for any kind of funding to come through to them. Whereas with the cash transfers, it goes directly into their bank account. So I think this is the beauty of the Indian experiment, that it is unconditional, unlike in many other parts of the world. It is being implemented at scale, which is, the sheer numbers are staggering. And in a context where we often talk about lack of state capacity, what unconditional cash transfers have taught us that actually the state has immense capacity. When there is political will, millions of women have been registered into these schemes overnight, and the digital infrastructure, along with a large number of the zero balance accounts, have actually come together to include women within this financial architecture. So I think it is unique. However, this is very important. We are beginning to see that in some states, the unconditional nature of the transfers beginning to become conditional. Now, this is a very serious warning, because in some states, like Haryana, for example, there had been some suggestions that you will get the cash transfer only if your children get a certain percentage of marks. And this has been our experience in relation to maternity benefits as well. When you have conditional cash transfers, and you require women to use the public health system, which is very weak to begin with, their failure to meet those conditions because your public health infrastructure is inadequate means that the burden of the cash transfers falls on the women themselves. So we must ensure that these unconditional cash transfers remain unconditional, because that is the true innovation of the Indian experiment. And for it to be, for it to result in women's empowerment, it has to remain unconditional.
Thank you so much, Professor Prabha.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.